Yes, I who commanded nations hundreds of years before you were born.
Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Films like Let Me In and Only Lovers Left Alive are elaborate examinations of a vampire's eternal life. And then there are others like What We Do in the Shadows that try to paint the vampire films with funny tones.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house. I must apologize for not being here to greet you personally.
But all of these films would have never come to life if Bram Stoker did not pen down his masterpiece. Stoker gave the world one of the most iconic villains of all time and the star of this video, Dracula. Over time, there have been numerous Dracula films, some as scary as the original 1922 film, some as adorable as Hotel Transylvania, and some outright crap like Dracula 3000. And yet, the origin and story of the Prince of Darkness are always a treat to watch. In this video, we'll explore the 20 most disturbing and monstrous Dracula versions, but I shall warn you, some of these would be disturbing just because how bad they were. So, this is more or less a list of the best and worst Draculas ever. Turn off those lights and get ready. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Number 1. Dracula in Van Helsing. Played by Richard Roxburgh, this Dracula was the son of Valerius the Elder, a great Transylvanian knight. Dracula was born in the year 1422, but 40 years later he was killed by the left hand of God.
I'm already dead.
However, that was not quite the end of this epic villain, and he made a pact with the fallen Son of God, who restored him with a new life and a curse that forced him to drink human blood to survive. When Valerius the Elder learned about the pact that his son had made with Satan, he felt disgraced and ashamed. The man sought forgiveness from God and promised that his future generations would not rest in peace until Dracula was slain. More than 400 years later, Dracula wanted to bring his spawns or children to life, and he convinced Frankenstein to create life from the dead. Frankenstein succeeded and created his monster. Dracula sought the formula from Frankenstein, but he refused, which forced Dracula to slay Frankenstein. However, Frankenstein's monster fled. Unbeknownst to Dracula, the undead man was the key to bringing Dracula's children to life. More than 400 years later, Dracula woke up from his icy sleep and decided to resume his plan of bringing his children to life. However, this time he faced Van Helsing, who once killed Dracula as the left hand of God.
Did I mention that it was you who murdered me?
Van Helsing was joined by Anna and Velkin, the last descendants of Valerius the Elder and a friar named Karl. Van Helsing stuck a stake in Dracula's heart, but that didn't kill the vampire. Even a crucifix melted in Dracula's hand. Through the course of the movie, Van Helsing is bitten by a werewolf, and it's his werewolf venom that ultimately kills Dracula for good. But he didn't really die because Dracula sells a lot in the market, and producers love him. Universal tries to bring many of its monsters together. Of course, there were Frankenstein's monster and Dracula, but the movie also featured the infamous Dr. Jekyll and his alter ego, Mr. Hyde. However, the film was largely underwhelming because of Roxburgh's portrayal of Dracula. Instead of sinking his teeth into people, he was trying to bite off large chunks of flesh. And what was that whole thing about bringing his children to life? I don't even want to talk about the massive bat beast he transforms into. I mean, that's not really who Dracula is, right? He's an eccentric count from the past who gets his way using his mind. That's probably the reason why people like director Stephen Sommers and Hugh Jackman could not save the movie from dying an early death.
Pack and go, and do not look back.
Number 2. Dracula in Castlevania, the Netflix show. The Dracula in the Netflix show was the most intelligent and strongest vampire in Castlevania's universe. He considered himself superior to humans and often addressed them as peasants. It was essentially his supreme power and intelligence that made him apathetic toward human beings, and Dracula didn't hesitate to slaughter people in the most brutal and sadistic ways, often leaving behind a bloody graveyard. And yet, he had no qualms about sparing those who he thought were innocent or did not plot to kill him or challenge his authority. Although the show doesn't throw much light on his origin and life before vampirism, it was established that Dracula preferred living a life of solitude in his castle. He saw no point messing with the petty humans, who grew to fear him so much that they stayed away from his castle. And yet, Dracula was not unknown to emotions and love. When a young medical researcher named Lisa came knocking on his door, he tried to send her away. But she was relentless and wanted to learn science from him. He was charmed by her personality, and the two of them soon formed a bond. Over the next few days, Lisa's good heart, her intelligence, civility, and courage further warmed the vampire's heart. Dracula and Lisa eventually get married and have a son named Alucard. He even granted his wife's request of traveling the world to seek more knowledge about science and medicine, and started believing that he could indeed help humanity. But tragedy struck Dracula when Lisa was falsely charged with witchcraft and hanged while he was still away. In a single moment, the light that had filled Dracula's heart turned into the endless darkness, and he vowed revenge against all of humanity, especially her killers. He promised to return a year later with an army of night creatures, and he kept his promise. Later, he decided to wage war against humanity itself. He even formed an army and installed vampire generals. But his plan was to kill all of humanity, an act that would leave the vampires without food. This forced his own generals to turn against him, but Dracula's will was as strong as a mountain. It was clear that Dracula wanted to kill humanity so that even the vampires would starve to death. But Dracula saw the errors in his plans when his son Alucard confronted him. The two of them fought a rather one-sided battle, and Dracula could have easily killed Alucard, but spared him because he could see that Alucard was right and he was wrong. All in all, this Dracula was the fierce vampire that he was supposed to be, but had several humane aspects, such as being capable of love and revenge. Also, he proved to be a good husband and father, who did not turn his family into vampires. Number 3. Count Dracula from BBC's 2020 miniseries Dracula. Played by Claes Bang, the Dracula in BBC's 2020 miniseries was a bloody love letter to a classic character. Count Dracula here felt like a homage to the many great counts that came before him, and yet Claes Bang brings an originality to the character, but credit is due to the writers Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat. So, the story starts with an undead man named Jonathan Harker, a lawyer who was retrieved from the waters by fishermen and brought to a convent in Budapest, where Agatha Van Helsing, a nun and expert on Dracula and vampirism, questions him in the presence of a nun named Sister Angela, who was actually Harker's fiancée, Mina. Harker reveals that he was a lawyer who was sent to talk to a mysterious client in Transylvania. As for the client, he was an old, long-in-the-tooth man who spoke in a questionable Transylvanian accent. But the client takes a liking to the poor lawyer, whose only wish is to reunite with his fiancée, and he couldn't say no to the client's request. The reason, you ask? I would say strict company policy. Count Dracula asks Harper to help him with the English language and the culture. It's not before long that Harper begins to feel the grievous effects of living in the Count's castle, which was pretty much a prison without locks. Count Dracula has been feeding on Harker and continues to grow younger, while Harker's own physiological and psychological states are exacerbated by the day. Once Harker realizes that the Count has been feeding on his blood, Harker somehow manages to escape the castle. It was now that Harker was brought to St. Mary's Convent in Budapest and given under the care of Sister Agatha Van Helsing. However, Count Dracula sniffed his way to Harker at the convent, but he cannot really enter without an invitation. He's eventually invited in by Jonathan, who is on his deathbed and slaughters the majority of the sisters. Mina, Murray, and Sister Agatha are the only two left alive in the convent, and in exchange for letting Mina escape, Agatha offers herself up to the Count in exchange for Mina's life. In the second episode of the show, Count Dracula is seen traveling to England on a boat named Demeter. There are other passengers as well on the boat, but they all come from different walks of life, and one would not expect such an assortment of people on a single small boat. It turns out that Count Dracula had cautiously selected these people, and they were serving as a dress rehearsal for his future stay in England. Count Dracula starts feeding on people, and the crew learns that there's a killer within their ranks. Meanwhile, Count Dracula keeps Agatha alive in Cabin 9, where no one but the captain is allowed to go. He put her in a dreamlike state where she was made to believe that Dracula was telling her the story about the ship while playing chess. But eventually, Agatha learns this was a lie and wakes up from the dream. Together with the crew of the ship, she manages to cause an explosion, which makes Dracula sleep for more than a century at the bottom of the ocean. However, in the year 2020, his crate is found on the Whitby coast, where he's inadvertently brought back from sleep by one of the men of Dr. Zoe Van Helsing, a descendant of Agatha. Zoe arrests Dracula, but he's freed by a lawyer whose firm has been representing the Count for ages. That was a bit bizarre, but nevertheless in the end, Dracula learns that he'd been living a decadent life for several centuries now, and that no one really loved him. He drinks the cancerous blood of Zoe, which ultimately kills him for good. Number 4. Dracula. 1958. The 1958 Dracula was the first major break for the Hammer horror films and started a chain reaction of Dracula films starring the legendary Christopher Lee. So, the film is set in the year 1885, when a British professor named Jonathan Harker arrives in Transylvania to take charge of a library there. However, he is in fact a vampire hunter and has travelled all the way from Britain to Transylvania to kill Dracula. He knows that Dracula is an unholy creature who feeds on people to live eternal life. Once inside Dracula's castle, Harker is greeted by the host. Unfortunately for Harker, his mission fails before it starts as he himself becomes a victim of one of Dracula's brides. Naturally, it's not before long that Harker himself turns and becomes a vampire. A few days later, Van Helsing comes back looking for Harker and finds that he's been turned. Helsing has no choice but to kill his old friend. Because Harker wanted to kill him, Dracula travels to England to take his revenge by turning Harker's wife, Lucy. Dracula wanted to make her one of his new brides, but Van Helsing was determined to end this undead menace. Dracula seduces Lucy and drinks her blood. Van Helsing tries to save her and keep Dracula away, but the master vampire's corruption kills her anyway, or at least turns her into a vampire. Dracula's next target is Lucy's sister-in-law, Mina. To save Mina, Dracula had to be destroyed, but he returned to Transylvania. In a final confrontation with the evil incarnate, Van Helsing manages to expose Dracula to the sunlight, thereby killing him and saving Mina. What makes the film Dracula so memorable and striking is that it seems Christopher Lee found something in the character that others had failed to. As original as Bela Lugosi's portrayal of the character, Christopher's glowing red eyes, his demeanor and charm made things just about perfect. Also, it was Christopher who added an erotic element to him. It wasn't just because women were leaving their necks open for him to sink his teeth in, but there was a mysterious physical appeal that came with a charming old lord who drains people's lives. Many women found this complete surrender very fascinating. Nevertheless, the 1958 film's success was such that it led to 8 sequels, 6 of which starred Christopher Lee as Dracula. Number 5. The Dracula from the Monster Squad. Played by Duncan Regehr, the film's Dracula was definitely evil, but not as scary as one expects him to be because the film itself was a horror comedy. Yet, Monster Squad had all the ingredients to become a cult classic. It stars a bunch of preteen kids who are fans of the classic movie monsters such as the Mummy, Frankenstein's monster, the Gill Man, the Wolfman, and of course, Dracula. When the kids managed to get Van Helsing's diary translated, they learned that in a few nights, these monsters will return to Earth from hell, and if they're not sent back, dark forces will take over Earth. And that's exactly what happens. Dracula returns from the limbo and brings with him the classic monsters of Universal Pictures. The Prince of Darkness turns out to be a frightening and vengeful figure for these kids. He leads his small army of undead monsters and would stop at nothing to have his way. What makes Duncan's Dracula a terrible being is his crude and unsavory nature. I mean, the guy didn't hesitate to address a young girl as a bitch. Contrary to the other Draculas, this one was the most uncivilized. I mean, yes, he drinks blood and all that, but come on, one's gotta behave like a count, right? So, I was more than happy when the Monster Squad sent this evil guy and his compatriots to the limbo. Too bad the film never saw a sequel. Six. Drake from Marvel's Blade. Long before Robert Downey Jr. wore the Iron Man suit and Chris Evans picked up his eponymous shield, it was director David S. Goya's Blade that brought a movie renaissance for Marvel. While the original was a masterpiece, the 2 sequels that followed lacked what one may call the bite in a vampire movie. While the film set up a great stage for an amazing Dracula, the movie's Dracula wasn't even called Dracula, and Dominic Purcell's character went about topless by the name Drake. When he wasn't revealing his chest, he was transforming into a hideous monster that was the result of some really questionable CGI. So, the Prince of Darkness in the Blade movies was the patriarch of all vampires, or the first vampire ever, from whom all the other blood-sucking creatures originated. Called Hominus Nocturna, the race of vampires terrorized humanity under Drake's leadership. Legend says that he was born around 7,000 years ago in the Mesopotamian civilization and was worshipped by the Babylonians as Dagon. But he became disgusted with the way the world functioned and slept through ages in a tomb in Iraq. According to the movie's lore, the Western culture became plagued with stories and incidents related to vampires, and in the late 19th century, Bram Stoker penned down his memorable piece of work. The Daywalker and vampire hunter Blade had started a crusade against the other vampires, and therefore the vampires Danica and Asher Talos discovered Drake's 4 millennia-old tomb to awaken him. Drake was the only other Daywalker apart from Blade and had the strength to end the vampire slaughter. It's not before long that Drake finds himself facing Blade. The two of them fight, and Drake feels some respect for Blade because both of them were equally powerful and rather honorable warriors. In the final battle, Drake takes his monstrous vampire form and almost kills Blade, but Blade uses a biological weapon to fatally wound Drake and kill all other vampires. Drake appreciates the warrior that Blade was, and as a parting gift, he takes the form of Blade before dying. This gave Blade time to flee. I really don't want to talk about Drake anymore, but I am thrilled about the 2024 film Blade, which would star Mahershala Ali in the titular role. Are you excited about it? Number 7. Vlad Dracula, from Francis Coppola's Dracula. After the Dracula film starring Christopher Lee became a success, many others tried their hands at making more and more Dracula films. More often than not, these ended in campy B-movies that were far away from the source material. However, Mr. Francis Ford Coppola delivered a masterpiece, minus the performance by Keanu Reeves. The film was lauded by critics and fans alike for the screenplay, the story, and the gravity that the story had. The film didn't take the path trodden by all, but took the road not taken and reflected on the source material, fusing it with some classic gothic romance. Much credit has to be given to the VFX team that created an elegantly scary monster. Vlad Dracula was a Romanian knight who served in the Sacred Order of the Dragon. In the year 1462, he was a part of the Christian army that was sent to fight the Ottoman Empire. After a long battle, the Christians emerged victorious, but the Ottomans shot an arrow toward Castle Dracula with a message which said that Vlad Dracula was slain in battle. This plunged his wife Elisabeta into an ocean of grief, and she threw herself into a river and died. When Dracula returned to his castle, he learned about his dear wife's death, but was more enraged because the priests told him that Elisabeta would end up in hell, because suicide was a great sin. Dracula's fury got the better of him, and he denounced God. He struck his sword into the chapel's stone cross, which caused it to spill blood. He drank this blood and collapsed to his death, only to return back as Dracula the vampire. I renounce him, and I will rise from his death to avenge hers, with all the powers of darkness. By the middle of the 19th century, Dracula starts living as Count Dracula and buys a property in London. When the solicitor, Jonathan Harker, comes to meet him, the Count sees the picture of Harker's fiancée, Mina, who resembles Elisabeta. He decides that he shall have Mina, imprisons Harker in the castle, and leaves for London on the ship called Demeter. He devours the crew on Demeter and reaches London. He then meets Mina in the alias of Prince Vlad of Zekli. However, by now, Mina receives word from Jonathan about his escape, and she leaves for Romania to marry him. Clearly, this enrages Dracula beyond measure. In the end, it's revealed that Mina was in fact a reincarnation of Elisabeta and that she remembered her past life. However, he dies in his demonic and vampiric form at the same chapel where he once denounced God, and Mina decapitates the vampire. The film has a starry cast, including the likes of Gary Oldman as Dracula, Winona Ryder as Mina, Anthony Hopkins as Abraham Van Helsing, and Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker. While a few critics have labeled the film as a lost opportunity, mostly because of Keanu Reeves' miscasting, the film has stood the test of time and remains a turning point as far as future Dracula films are concerned. Number 8. Count Orlok from the 1922 version of Nosferatu. Sometimes you get it right the first time, right? So, Nosferatu, or Count Orlok, is the oldest entry in our list. To be precise, he's exactly 100 years old and appeared in the 1922 movie. This German adaptation of Bram Stoker's work remains grounded in the source material and retains the original traits of Dracula, such as long, pointy claws and fanged teeth. Furthermore, he has extremely long hands and an overtly pronounced nose, which may be a bit of an exaggeration of the aquiline nose that Dracula had. Apart from the bushy eyebrows, Orlok is entirely bald and also has pointy ears. Clearly, the makers made him more monstrous than what was depicted in the book, and we couldn't be more grateful. He's anything but the sophisticated warlord or knight that we came to witness in the later films. Not much is known about his history, apart from the fact that his birth father was Belial, one of the minions or rather lieutenants of Satan himself. So, for as long as one can remember, Orlok has been residing in a dilapidated castle in a lost part of Carpathia, where he haunts and feeds on people. He posed as a nobleman from the nearby Carpathian mountains and moved to the German city of Wisborg. The locals ensure that they don't wander anywhere close to Orlok's castle. However, one Thomas Hutter, a real estate agent, goes to Count Orlok's castle to work for him. Later, Count Orlok hides in a crate filled with soil from his home, and the crate is loaded on a ship. As would be expected, Orlok kills every living soul on the ship. Only the captain of the ship and the first mate remain alive, but even they meet sorry ends. Once at his destination, Count Orlok goes after Hutter's wife, Ellen. He stalks and attacks her, but he's so engrossed with drinking from her that he forgets to keep track of time. He hears a rooster crowing and realizes that it was daytime, and as the sun's rays fall on him, he burns into a cloud of smoke. And thus, the terror of Count Orlok ends for all. Number 9. Count Dracula from the Cliffhangers, 1979. So, as far back as 1979, NBC released a series with 1-hour-long episodes, each divided into 3 dramatized segments. The last of these told the story of Count Dracula, starring Michael Nouri in the titular role. The objective of the show was to depict the blood-sucking monster as a tragic figure from one of Shakespeare's dramas, a man who destroys the things he loves. It was originally intended that this Dracula would avoid all the campy stuff, which somewhat became the staple in the 1970s. In fact, he was almost the hero of the show, and clearly it wasn't an easy job to make someone like Dracula look like the good guy on screen. So, much like the other 2 serials of the series, Curse of Dracula started off midway, and the first episode of the show was supposed to be the 6th chapter of a story that was already underway. We meet the protagonists, Kurt and Mary. Kurt was a descendant of the legendary vampire hunter Van Helsing, and Mary was the daughter of one of Dracula's victims. Using computers, the 2 of them learned about a set of 20 coffins filled with Transylvanian soil that Dracula had brought with himself. However, his real identity was still in darkness. In the first chapter, the 2 of them were trying to destroy the 13th coffin, having destroyed the first 12 in the non-existent 5 chapters. However, Dracula got to know about Kurt and Mary's adventures and trapped them by burning the barn they were in, but they managed to escape. Later, the couple learns that there's a professor of East European history who only teaches at night. Mary begins attending his classes in disguise, and after a few nights, Dracula knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. The story then progresses in the same fashion as the movies that came previously, and yet it was a bit different than The Flock. Dracula explains to Mary that he feels cursed because of the fate he's been condemned to. He explains how disturbed and morose he is, not seeing daylight in the past 512 years, and on top of that is the fact that he can't help but give in to his passion for living and possess whatever he loves. But possession meant death for the other person. Although not scary enough, the show was a fresh take on Dracula's undead life.
Il cuore, Abraham! Devi colpirmi al cuore!
Number 10. Dracula 3D, 2012. The first 2 decades of the 21st century saw a revival of 3D movies in Hollywood, but these were not IMAX 3Ds that Marvel seems to have excelled in. These were bad 3D movies with even worse CGI. One such film during this period was Dario Argento's Dracula on Dracula 3D. Little less than a blatant farce from the beginning itself, the film remains as far away from Bram Stoker's novel as anything could get. Yes, it does follow more or less the same plot, but the tension is entirely missing. The one-dimensional characters and their poor acting made Dracula 3D unintentionally funny, and its titular character a 2-hour-long bad joke. Of course, sex and gore were in abundance, but that's about it. Thomas Kretschmann as Dracula was neither seductive nor scary, and Rutger Hauer as Abraham Van Helsing lacked the bite that is required to slay someone like Dracula. In the film, Dracula had lost his beloved many centuries ago, and has since been sucking the blood of sorry men and women while looking for his beloved's look-alike. Much like in the other movies, he finds this said woman in the form of Mina, the wife of a librarian that Dracula had hired. One thing leads to another, and Dracula has Mina under his control and hypnotism. Did we miss something? Oh yes. Van Helsing comes in looking like a man tired of life and saves the day by fighting many creatures, including a huge praying mantis. This one has to be one of the worst Dracs ever.
See whom you love the most, and there is not a single thing in the world you can do to stop me.
Number 11. Dracula in Dead and Loving It. Leslie Nielsen as Count Dracula and Mel Brooks as Dr. Abraham Van Helsing could be called the stars of this parodic take on Bram Stoker's novel. Dead and Loving It was nothing as good as other horror films like Shaun of the Dead or What We Do in the Shadows, which also features a Nosferatu, by the way. The Dracula from this film was obviously a rather elegant-looking vampire who unsurprisingly fails in almost everything he does. He does manage to sink his teeth into a few of the characters, but as a comedy film, it lacks bite. The issue is that Mel Brooks repeats the age-old and gives them a vampiric spin. Nevertheless, you can still have a fun time with Nielsen's Dracula, as long as you're loaded with a few chilled ones.
Join my legion of the undead.
Not interested.
Number 12. The Batman vs. Dracula animated film. This 2005 animated film pits Batman against a rather unlikely opponent, Dracula. But let's not be surprised, he's even fought the Predators. So, as far as these crossovers go, anything is possible. So, the film's Dracula has his origin grounded in Bram Stoker's original work and hails from Transylvania, and was put to sleep by Professor Van Helsing. However, his coffin was moved to Gotham at some point. The only difference in his backstory is his beloved wife, who was named Camilla Karnstein. Nevertheless, Penguin and Joker learn about a treasure that's resting somewhere in Gotham Cemetery. The two of them venture to find it, and while Joker is intercepted and electrocuted by Batman, Penguin accidentally revives Dracula when he cuts his hand on his umbrella sword. The King of Vampires is now free to act, and the first thing he does is hypnotize Penguin so that the Gotham villain can serve as a daytime sentinel. Dracula then visits one of the parties that Bruce Wayne was hosting and presents himself as Dr. Alucard. I guess Dracula is many things, but he sucks at names. Anyway, after people start disappearing around the clock, Batman deciphers that Alucard is in fact Dracula. But witnesses mention seeing a bat-like entity at the crime scenes, and the needle of suspicion invariably points at Batman. By now, Dracula has become obsessed with rebuilding Gotham in his own image. He turns several more Gothamites. At one point, Dracula managed to momentarily hypnotize Batman, who Dracula thought was a creation of his own legacy. When Dracula meets Vicky Vale, Batman's love interest and a reporter, the Prince of Darkness becomes hexed, because she was the spitting image of his lost love, Camilla. So, what does Dracula do next? Well, of course, he plans to resurrect Camilla by sacrificing Vicky Vale's soul. But Batman saves the day once again and stops the ritual by rescuing Vicky. Batman cured the several people that Dracula had turned, and this draws all of Drac's attention to Batman. However, Batman draws the Son of Darkness to the Batcave, where the Dark Knight has a prototype solar energy storing machine, which he uses to destroy Dracula once and for all. Interestingly, Batman then goes on to use Dracula's skull as a trophy exhibit. That's beyond dark, I assume. Number 13. Dracula, 2006. Produced by Granada Television for WGBH Boston and BBC Wales in 2006, the film stars Mark Warren as Dracula. The BBC is known to transform some good classics into TV adaptations, and they came very close to Bram Stoker's work. In the movie, the Romanian Count is called to London by a young lord named Arthur Holmwood, who contracted syphilis soon after getting engaged to Lucy Westenra. The two of them can't consummate their marriage, but Lucy is unaware of exactly why Arthur keeps his hands off her. When Arthur learns from a cult-like organization that only Dracula can help him, he invites the said Count. It's not before long that Arthur realizes that Dracula's powers originate from a curse. Of course, there's a Van Helsing in the story, but he's not in his glorious years and seems rather critical of taking any active part in a battle. The life-beaten man fashions a fake beard and is kept prisoner of the said cult until his release. The good guys beat Dracula, but in the end, he miraculously comes back to life in a manner of speaking. As far as Mark Warren's Dracula is concerned, he first appears in some mud-packed makeup with gross-looking nails and goes on to rejuvenate into a hairy and shabbily dressed figure who has little to no personality of the legendary king of vampires. I wouldn't say he's the worst Dracula ever, but he uses more hands than teeth, and almost always can be seen seductively touching people's necks and faces before ripping their heads off. And this feeble Dracula receives a feebler end, with the protagonist staking Dracula's back and not even knowing if the stake went through the heart. Number 14. Blood for Dracula, 1974. Blood for Dracula stars Udo Kier in the titular role and is a peculiar take on the exhausted tale of Dracula. So, it's the early 1920s and Count Dracula is in a dying and weak condition because he's not finding enough virgin blood in his hometown. Apparently, drinking the blood of non-virgin women makes him weaker. So, his servant Anton suggests that they should move to Italy, a primarily Catholic country which would have a more regular supply of virgin girls. After reaching Italy, Count Dracula befriends Marchese di Fiore, a penniless landowner whose lavish and grand estate is on a decline. So, di Fiore agrees to wed Dracula to one of his 4 daughters, whom he claims are all virgins. Di Fiore knew that Dracula was a wealthy aristocrat and needed the money. However, Safiria and Rubinia, the second and the third daughters of di Fiore, are not exactly virgins because they engage in some nocturnal activities with Mario, the handyman of the estate. But the eldest daughter Esmeralda and the youngest daughter Perla are virgins. Dracula drinks the blood of Safiria and Rubinia, who were of marriageable age, and learns that they were not virgins. This leaves him further weakened, but he manages to convert the 2 girls into his telepathic slaves. weird shit begins to happen when Mario learns that Dracula was a vampire, and Mario goes on to force himself upon the 14-year-old Perla in the pretense of saving her from Dracula. In the end, Mario kills Dracula with an axe and becomes the de facto master of De Fiore's estate. No, I don't think the film's Dracula was scary, but I do love the new flavor.
I'll simply say...
Number 15, Hotel Transylvania, the adorable Dracula. Russian-American animation director Genndy Tartakovsky took a big leap from action-packed stuff such as Samurai Jack when he directed the lovable and adorable Hotel Transylvania. The star of the show is clearly Adam Sandler's Dracula, who's less of a bloodsucker and more of an overbearing father, whose only wish is the safety and happiness of his daughter Mavis and all the other monsters, for whom he quite literally built Hotel Transylvania, where only monsters were welcome. Count Dracula teaches his daughter all about the bad things that humans did and how evil humanity was, but he does so primarily because he's a super possessive father who loves his daughter just a bit too much. I want all the fathers of lovely daughters to give me a high five in the comments. How many of those can I get? Anyway, the franchise's Dracula loved his wife Martha, but when she died, he placed his distrust on humanity and swore to keep her daughter away from them. After Martha, Mavis became his world, and he would kill to protect her, but I'm not sure if this adorable Dracula could actually kill someone. Clearly an overprotective and overbearing father, he would often go out of his way to deceive Mavis into believing that humanity was violent and evil. In one such incident, he used his zombie hotel employees to pose as a fake human settlement and scare away Mavis. Having said that, Dracula rightly recognizes the prejudice and cruelty that humanity is capable of, and over time he comes to believe that the monsters would never be completely accepted as a part of mainstream society. Of all the monsters, he trusted Frankenstein the most, and we've seen by now that the two of them actually share quite a bit of history. At least several movies hint at that. In fact, Frankenstein was actually named goduncle of Mavis, but eventually his opinion about humanity transforms, or at least it mellows down. I don't know about you, but Hotel Transylvania's Dracula has set some really serious father goals for me. Number 16, Frank Langella in and as Dracula, 1979. Have you ever imagined what it would be like if Van Helsing was the father of a young woman recently turned by Dracula? Well, that's quite the story of this 1979 film directed by John Badham, starring Frank Langella as Count Dracula and Laurence Olivier as Professor Abraham Van Helsing. So, the year was 1913 and Count Dracula arrived in Whitby, Yorkshire, from Transylvania on a ship named Demeter. The ship had run aground and Mina Van Helsing, the daughter of Abraham Van Helsing, finds Count Dracula and saves him. Later, Dracula visits Mina and her friends at the clifftop mansion of Dr. Jack Seward, who was the father of Lucy Seward, Mina's friend and Jonathan Harker's fiancé. Dracula impresses people present at the dinner, but Jonathan is not impressed. Strangely enough, Jonathan is a Romanian count in the movie, which is quite unlike the other Jonathans we've seen, who are usually solicitors or librarians. Later that night, Dracula reveals his true identity to Mina and sinks his teeth into her, drinking her blood. While Lucy believes that she shouldn't have left Mina alone, Dr. Seward calls Professor Abraham Van Helsing, who immediately suspects that a vampire may have killed his daughter. And now Van Helsing will have to take care of his undead daughter and the age-old monster that's lurking in the shadows. While the film itself is well above the run-of-the-mill Dracula films, it was Frank Langella's portrayal of the vampire that most impressed me. He serves as a dominant and aggressive force who wants to have Miss Lucy at all costs and doesn't even care about the implications. As a man, Langella's Dracula was an erotic one who takes women by force and gently at the same time, a quality that almost no woman would dare to resist. Not only does he offer a kind of sexual abandonment that mortals cannot provide, but Dracula also offers immortality. However, Dracula here was still vulnerable, and correctly so. But then again, he was not someone indifferent or with no sense of humor. I can go as far as to say that the film's Dracula was portrayed as a man who truly fell in love and wanted little more than to spend the rest of his undead life with her. But more importantly, Langella brought a fresh perspective to Dracula, and he didn't look or act like Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee. Number 17, Love at First Bite. If there is one Dracula spoof I could watch time and again, it has to be Love at First Bite. In the movie, Count Dracula lived a life of fun and frolic, blood and teeth for several centuries. He would kill a maiden here, a man there, drink their blood and come back to his giant castle to live a life of peace. But then communism happened in Romania. The government knocked on Count Dracula's door and took his castle, just because a few gymnasts needed a new training facility. With nowhere to live and world-weary, the Count comes to New York City, Since the time he set foot in the country, his American dream seemed more than difficult to be turned into a reality, and airport transport confusion sent the poor Count's precious coffin to serve as the centerpiece of a Harlem funeral. But all is not lost for Count Dracula because he learns that America was home to discos, sex clubs, and blood banks. What more could a vampire want? He soon falls in love with a model named Cindy, who looks like Drac's long dead and decomposed lover. But this fair lady has a boyfriend named Jeffrey, who happens to be a descendant of Drac's arch-enemy, Van Helsing. Jeffrey uses the usual garlic, mirror, and silver tricks to take down Dracula, but fails. He even tries to burn Dracula and the coffin, but security apprehends him for arson. Soon, Jeffrey is put in an asylum because of his seemingly lunatic claims and actions, but is later released by an NYPD cop named Ferguson, who draws connections between Jeffrey's claims and the recent blood bank robberies. In the end, Cindy agrees to become Dracula's bride, and the two of them transform into bats and fly away. This was one movie where Dracula got his bride. No one really died a gruesome death, and everyone lived happily ever after, quite literally.
Selena, what are you doing?
Number 18. The bare-chested Gerard Butler in Dracula 2000. At the turn of the new millennium, there was a wave that struck filmmakers and producers which made them bring back old legends in modern flavors. Dracula was one such victim of this wave. While the late Wes Craven is known for some epic horror movies like Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, and the original Hills Have Eyes, he's also lent his hand to some crap like Dracula 2000. In the movie, Matthew Van Helsing is supposed to be a descendant of Abraham Van Helsing. He runs an antique shop in London and spends most of his time at the shop. One night, Matthew's secretary Selina brings 4 thieves to the shop. They break into the shop's high-security underground vault and find a coffin sealed with silver. They break through the deadly defense system and feel that the coffin must be highly valuable, given the high-end security employed to protect it. The thieves realize a bit too late that they just unleashed the Prince of Darkness, who would wreak havoc in his long black hair and bare chest. Oh, and by the way, it turns out that Matthew is, in fact, the original Van Helsing, who has been keeping himself alive and well by taking a regular supply of Dracula's blood. And as far as Dracula is concerned, he's revealed to be Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus for a few silver coins and was therefore condemned to live on Earth and fear silver. The scariest thing about this Dracula was his acting, which was half bad and half average. I think if Dracula saw the movie, he'd prefer to stay asleep for another millennium and wake up in 3000, when the world will have forgotten that something as sinful as Dracula 2000 once existed. But wait, there is a movie called Dracula 3000.
Namely, dinner.
Number 19. Dracula 3000. So, do you remember the time when Jason Voorhees decided to go to space and continue his carnage there? Yeah, well, Dracula 3000 tries to do quite the same thing, but trust me, this film is worse than Jason X, and clearly the worst Dracula film ever. When a bunch of spacefarers find an abandoned ship named Demeter, they try to salvage it. Commanding them is Captain Van Helsing. Then there's a Count Orlok and an undercover android cop, and whatnot. The film has an IMDb rating of 2.1. Need I say more? Number 20. Nosferatu the Vampire, 1979. Although the film will most certainly scare the holy daylight out of you, confining the film scope to horror or a vampire flick would be criminal and highly understated. Nosferatu the Vampire not only packs great horror sequences and a rich story, but has all the necessary ingredients to make it a great drama as well. When estate agent Jonathan Harker is asked to go to Transylvania to see that a lucrative deal is signed with Count Dracula, he leaves his beautiful and pure-hearted wife Lucy at Wismar. The deal is crucial for Jonathan's career, and he makes a week-long arduous journey to reach Count Dracula's castle. On his way, he had stopped at a village inn, where people warned him about Dracula and his vampiric nature. But being a skeptic, Jonathan didn't believe them and went anyway. Upon reaching the castle, he met Dracula, who had long fingernails, sharp teeth, pale skin, and a rodent-like appearance. Somehow, Dracula got to see Lucy's portrait and got enchanted by her appearance. He immediately agreed to purchase the property in Wismar, but to Jonathan's horror and shock, he discovered that the villagers were speaking the truth, and Dracula was indeed a vampire. That night, Dracula left for Wismar and imprisoned Jonathan in the castle. Jonathan will have to free himself and reach Wismar in time to save Lucy, but will he? Meanwhile, Lucy learns about the diabolic Count's weakness. Director Werner Herzog created a film that explains and examines the dreadful things that befall the unwary and uncautious. The film is essentially considered to be a stylistic remake of F.W. Murnau's 1922 masterpiece Nosferatu, but Herzog's film has its own distinct point of view of Count Dracula and his personality. personality, with some really great pieces of acting from the likes of Klaus Kinski, Isabelle Adjani, and Bruno Ganz. Nosferatu the Vampire finds its way on any list that compiles top horror films of all time. Clearly, there are all kinds of Draculas out there, some scary as hell, while the rest are just unintentionally funny. In fact, there was one blaxploitation of Dracula called Blackula as well. The point is, Dracula has continued to be an overarching antagonist in films and shows, and I think he'll continue to do even more in the future. After all, he's undead. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.